BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, and thank you for listening to the Farming Today This Week podcast. I'm Kaz Graham. This week, the government has refused emergency use of pesticides shown to harm pollinators for the first time. What's the future for US agriculture if farm workers with no documents are deported? And will the collective voice of the supermarkets make a difference on inheritance tax for farmers?
There's a real concern for supermarkets that if these tax burdens are not alleviated, it could impact the sector as a whole and lead to, volatility within supply chains.
First, though, all this week we've been discovering the jobs that farmers get done in January when it's not blowing a force 10 gale, that is. This month is peak time for getting hedges laid and maintained before birds start nesting in them in the spring. With an increase in hedge planting, there's plenty of work going on. But farmers are concerned that the suspension of government capital grants in England, which in many cases pay for that work, will lead to hedges being neglected. Bob Hockenhull reports.
Steve Budding has been hedge laying for nearly 50 years. Today he's on a farm in Leicestershire managing a thorn hedge planted 20 years ago that needs some maintenance.
It's an art, really. It's an art form. It's got to be cut down to the floor so it grows up from the floor and regenerates all that hedge and thickens the bottom out. You're just cutting into it and bending it over, and all the new growth comes out of the floor. It sprouts straight away in the spring. We do something like in the region of 5 kilometres a year.
And it's pretty cold at the moment. Does that bother you?
Not for this job, it's not. You're never cold hedge laying.
Are there as many hedges being planted now as
there's
ever?
more, far more, because to go on to about the environmental side, really, there's been a massive uplift in hedge planting. There's thousands of miles almost up and down the country gone in recently because they have, they've gone in with grants. It's a very important topic, hedgerows, really. We've got carbon capture, we've got field margins, we've got, there's so much to hedges. A hedge can sustain 2,000 different species, believe it or not. We've got everything from wood mice right the way through. And the wildlife corridors are very, very important. What makes England England?
And I know there has been some concerns because the capital grants have been suspended to pay farmers for having hedges planted or maintained. How do you feel about that?
It just seems to me to be an assault on rural life. There isn't money in farming to sustain hedge laying, for instance. If it wasn't for the grant, we wouldn't. I should say 90% of my work is grant. When you hear of it stopping, all of a sudden the brakes come on for next year. The whole thing comes to a halt, so we really, really do need these grants back.
The farm Steve is working on belongs to John Stanley.
Without the grant, we wouldn't be doing it. So we do get a pretty much, I guess it goes about 90% of the way to paying for all the work, the hedge laying and then the fencing that we have to put up on either side to protect it. So, without that grant, we wouldn't be doing it. And so it's very much appreciated that we can get it.
And they have been suspended at the moment. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think horror, really. I mean, the suspension has been on new capital grants going forward, hasn't it? So we hope that these that have already been agreed will be honoured, which I guess will be the case. But I think we're all a bit nervous as an industry as to what is happening with the grants. And, we like some certainty going forward.
DEFRA says capital grants supported agreements to plant over 4,000 miles of new hedgerows across England in 2024. It suspended some capital grants because of unprecedented demand, which was unsustainable. The decision is due to be reviewed soon, giving hope to professional hedge layers like Steve that they'll still be in business for years to come.
Bob Hockenhull reporting. Well, for sheep farmers, January is scanning time. That's when pregnant ewes are scanned to see how many lambs they're carrying. Knowing how many new arrivals to expect makes things an awful lot easier come lambing time. And it also tells you how well the rams or the tups have performed. Dan Tailforth's dad started out as a sheep scanner in Cumbria 40 years ago, and today Dan follows in his footsteps. He's in constant demand from December through until March, but our reporter Helen Millican just managed to catch up with him and discovered that the key to successful scanning isn't just sophisticated equipment. You also need spray paint, a sturdy notebook and a lot of teamwork.
Another day, another set of pregnant ewes for Dan Tailforth to scan. Today, on the East Fellside slopes of the Eden Valley at Crindledyke, it's the North of England mules belonging to Mark Bowman.
I've got half an eye on Dan with his scanner and half an eye on Chris seeing how he marks the sheep. Singles will be marked on the shoulder, twins will be left with no marks on them because hopefully the majority are twins. Triplets will have a mark on the rump so that we can move into the year knowing how many lambs are expecting, and also take the geld ones out, the ones without their lambs in, and they'll probably be sold.
How tense a day is this for you then?
It's probably quite good that we stand quite a few before you arrive today, Helen, because there was a lot of triplets in the first lot. Luckily my wife's gone to work because she feeds the pet lambs, and so she's going to be none too pleased when she finds out there's a lot of multiple births, but it's your lamb crop for the year and it's your income.
I notice you're not looking over Dan's shoulder.
I'll tell you so, I've been looking at that screen for years and I still can't fathom it out. Luckily for us, Dan knows what he's doing.
One. My first port of call is to make contact with the sheep, and once I've created the contact, the screen will then just look like blobs and scribbles to everybody else. The blobs, that shows us that the yow's in lamb, and then I've got to search through the blobs and find heads and rib cages. We've got 2 skulls on the screen there, go through the womb, out at the far end, and there's 2 bodies just there.
How important is timing when you're scanning?
I can only see pregnancies from 40 days, so anything below 40 days doesn't show up on the screen to me, so she'll be gelled. At the other end, if she gets over the 80 to 90 days, on these type of sheep, where you're looking for triplets, quads, you need the lambs a bit smaller so you can find them all. Otherwise, once the lambs grow, they start blocking each other out. At 75 days today, the lamb inside the sheep's probably the size of your thumbnail to your thumb, and if it gets any bigger than that, it just becomes a lot harder. Having the sheep presented empty, so they've been off silage overnight, allows us to be more accurate with the job we're doing.
I imagine when your dad started mine, the equipment would not be quite so sophisticated.
No, when he first started, they had to turn the sheep upside down and sit it on its bum, and they would clip the wool off its belly and scan it that way. They then developed to this side cush where the sheep just runs in and stays standing.
Less stressful for the sheep?
Yeah, and less labour intensive. This way the sheep's just in and it's out, it's gone, it doesn't know it's happened. So as far as it knows, all I've done is rub its belly and it's gone again, so it's not stressful for her at all really. Great team here today, just runs so smooth, got a nice long race, plenty of pens back there. People that know what they're doing, and the sheep just keep flowing right through. My end, you couldn't ask for any better, really.
And I noticed a little bit less high-tech, you have a notebook.
Oh, call this the Bible. If the farmer presents every batch separately, we record the batches separately for them, so that then they know that tub's maybe performed a bit better than another one. We tell them how many singles, how many twins, how many triplets, how many quads, how many late tup sheep they've got, the total and the percentage of what that batch has done for them.
That's one heck of a data collection exercise, isn't it?
That's the Bible.
You're getting a glowing report, Mark, for your
right?
exceptionally well-prepared sheep. What happens next?
These will all get split up, and it's particularly the triplets you want taken out of the batch, and we'll start feeding fodder bait to them, up in the game as far as the feeding goes. You're just trying to do what's within your power to help the sheep and also help yourself.
So you're going to sleep well tonight then?
Yeah, I won't be waking up thinking what a mess I've got. I'll be quite satisfied at the end of the day that up to press we've done our job well, and thankfully so have the sheep and the tups.
Cumbrian sheep farmer Mark Bowman. Now, I'm not sure if sheep scanner Dan Tailforth fits into this category. He might well do. Do let us know, because we're on the lookout for rural community champions for an upcoming week on the people who are the backbone of your village or your community. You know, the people who get things done and generally make the world a better place. If somebody springs to mind, do let us know. Drop us an email to farming.today@bbc.uk. Promises to tackle nature loss and boost biodiversity by the Welsh Government have been called into question in a highly critical report. The Senate's Environment Committee warned that ministers lacked a plan, action and investment to reverse worrying declines in wildlife. 1 in 6 species are currently at risk of vanishing from Wales, as BBC Wales environment correspondent Stefan Messenger reports.
So this is our arable margin that we've planted last year. So this is now full of lots of wildflowers that produce lots of seed.
On these fields in the Vale of Glamorgan, the local farmer's been working with conservationists to make space for nature, planting wildflower corridors, acting as a larder for birds like yellowhammers throughout the year, and giving a species threatened with extinction in Wales a chance.
Rhys Jenkins and the farm here, the hedgerows and everything are full of birds feeding on the strip, so you can see it's working, and take a bit of pride in it as well. There's a lot of hard work and hours that go into doing this and planting it, that you do get good results.
Across Wales, wildlife is being lost at an alarming rate, says a new report from the Senedd's Environment Committee. It accuses the Welsh Government of lacking a plan, action and investment, with key policy documents meant to guide their work on nature loss years out of date. The committee's report partly blames a lack of staff and resource devoted to nature within Welsh Government, and singles out cutbacks to the environment watchdog Natural Resources Wales too.
My name is Rob Parry and I work for the Initiative for Nature Conservation Cymru. It's what we in the conservation sector have been saying for a long time now, that Welsh Government and NRW simply haven't been doing enough for nature. And worse than that, they've been saying lots of good things, so you can end up kidding yourself. There are a lot of good stuff's happening. So I'm glad the report is there, but we need to act on it now. We need to start doing stuff.
The government is set to unveil a big nature bill with new environmental protections later this year, though it told the committee legally binding targets for boosting biodiversity wouldn't be ready for another 4 years, taking us to 2029. That's significant because of Welsh Minister's support for a landmark international agreement struck here at the COP15 summit in Canada 3 years ago to halt and start to reverse the declines in nature worldwide by 2030.
Llyr Griffith, member of the Senedd and chair of the Senedd's Climate Change, Environment and Infrastructure Committee. So if the targets aren't in place by until 2029, then, really the government can't be serious about meeting the 2030 target, and that means reneging on an international commitment that they've made. That isn't acceptable. We need to see faster action from the government and not this foot dragging.
The Welsh Government said it was committed to tackling the nature crisis, pointing to work to restore peatland, create a national forest and thousands of green spaces in local communities. Hywel Anker Davies is the Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Climate Change.
Some of the reporting on this, it all falls on the pessimism side and none of the good things we're doing. And the worry with that is people will say, well, there's nothing we can achieve. We're actually doing massive, not just investment, but also tackling it day by day with people, with volunteers throughout Wales. It isn't just a Welsh Government thing. This is all of us in Wales here together to tackle the loss of biodiversity and then lead to restoration of biodiversity as well. So, look, we genuinely welcome the report that's come forward. It provides the challenge for us, but I think what we need to do to say to people is there is a way to actually deal with these massive challenges around nature and biodiversity, and we'll do them together.
NRW said it too would review the report's recommendations and that the scale of the challenge facing nature meant everyone needed to do more, working together across government, business and society. This report makes difficult reading for a government which says it takes pride in its green credentials, while raising the alarm more widely too about the state of nature across Wales.
Stefan Messenger reporting. There are concerns that food production in the United States could be affected by President Trump's plans for the mass deportation of illegal immigrants. Donald Trump has said that the deportation of criminals and national security threats will be his priority, but hasn't ruled out extending deportations more broadly to include undocumented farm workers. The US has a system rather like our seasonal workers scheme, where people can come from abroad to work on a farm for a limited time, usually to harvest. But many thousands more farm employees are actually living in the US illegally. Antonio de Luera from the United Farm Workers Union told Anna Hill a huge proportion of farm workers are undocumented.
There are different numbers out there, but it's at least 40%. Some estimates go as high as 70%. It probably varies quite dramatically by region.
And how long might undocumented farm workers have been living and working in the US?
The vast majority, at least 10 years. I think the average is closer to 20 years. Most farm workers are of Mexican origin, probably came to the United States sometime in the mid-90s to early 2000s. That was kind of the peak of undocumented migration from Mexico. And then that workforce really became essential to agriculture, certainly in California and then across the United States.
And do we know what sectors they're mainly working in? Dairy, fruit and veg?
Every agricultural sector, you would expect to find undocumented folks, at least the labor-intensive ones. I think maybe out in the Great Plains where it's more wheat, right? That's maybe one or two folks driving a mechanical combine. Even there, you'll probably find occasional undocumented workers, but certainly in dairy, it's overwhelming. Probably 80% of the workforce, 90% of the workforce is undocumented in dairy. Fruits, nuts, vegetables, the more labor-intensive a crop is, right, the more workers you need and the more likely you are to really be relying on undocumented labor. I think the one real exception is in parts of the Southeast, particularly Georgia and Florida, you do have large numbers of guest workers. So this is the legal guest worker program called the H-2A visa, which is only for seasonal industries.
How concerned are you about President Trump's promises to deport illegal migrants?
Well, we're certainly very concerned, and I'll say that 2 weeks ago now in Kern County, which is in California in the area around Bakersfield, maybe an hour and a half north of Los Angeles, but in the agricultural Central Valley, we had really serious Border Patrol raids. We believe they rounded up and detained as many as 200 individuals, and we know that some of those individuals did end up in Mexico already. This was before Trump was even inaugurated. We're already seeing this kind of emboldened environment. I think the other thing to mention as far as the kind of impacts on the workplace is, yes, after some of these raids, we do see a lot of workers stay home. Certainly 2 weeks ago now in the Bakersfield area, we're in the middle of the citrus harvest, so harvesting oranges, lemons. We heard reports of employers, farmers saying that as many as 75% of their workers did not show up in the days after that raid, and certainly that has a disruptive impact.
The thing is, though, they are illegal migrants, aren't they? Some people would say, look, this is fair enough. They shouldn't be there.
I think that this is the irony of American society, is that there is no way that American agriculture would function without this workforce.
Would Americans do these jobs?
I think that's the wrong question. I think there is... what's very clear from what the agricultural industry is lobbying for is they want to expand the H-2A guest worker program, which I already mentioned. That's their solution. They say, look, these deportations are happening. It's going to disrupt our workforce. Therefore, Congress needs to give us the ability to import more cheap foreign labor. What we're saying is, no. We don't want to just replace one cheap foreign workforce with another. We want to protect the existing workforce and extend to them the rights of citizenship.
That's Antonio de Loera from the United Farm Workers in the United States. Farmers in England will not be allowed to use neonicotinoid pesticides on sugar beet crops this year, after an application for emergency use was turned down by the government for the first time. Chris Ledyard has the details.
Neonics are used by farmers to protect sugar beet from virus yellows, a disease spread by aphids. But they're toxic to pollinators like bees. Because of that, they were banned by the EU back in 2013 for use on oilseed rape, then in 2018 for use on sugar beet. Those bans were carried over into UK law after Brexit. But since then, the previous government granted an emergency authorisation for neonics to be used on sugar beet for 4 years in a row. Labour has pledged to ban their use completely, but under current rules was obliged to consider an application that went in over the summer for another emergency authorisation. That has now been turned down. The National Farmers Union has said it's disappointing and has called for an urgent meeting with DEFRA, arguing growers are left without a single viable solution to protect their crop in 2025 if disease pressure is severe. Meanwhile, environmental groups have welcomed the decision, but some want the ban now to be extended beyond agricultural use to things like garden sprays and pet flea treatments.
Chris, thank you. Now, if you are out and about today, you may well hear some of this. There's been no let-up in recent weeks in the dispute over the proposed inheritance tax on farms. Later on today, the UK's farming unions will be taking part in what they're calling a Day of Unity. The unions say farmers will be gathering at locations right across the UK with tractor rallies and demonstrations to put their case to the public and show the government they're determined to continue their campaign. Earlier in the month, the DEFRA Secretary Steve Reed said he was sorry decisions had upset farmers, but argued stable finances are the foundation of the economic growth needed and outlined a new deal for farmers that, he said, would help them become more profitable. Meanwhile, the supermarkets have added their voice to the argument. Speaking in Parliament this week, Shadow DEFRA Secretary Victoria Atkins asked Treasury Minister James Murray this.
Why does he think that Tesco, Sainsbury's, Asda, Morrison's, Marks and Spencer, Aldi, Lidl and Co-op all have come out against this tax policy and believe the Treasury's figures to be wrong? Why are they wrong and he thinks he's right?
And the response was this.
We're working in partnership with the large supermarket chains to make sure they're driving economic growth. We're very clear that some of the decisions we had to take at budget were difficult decisions which will have consequences, but we're determined to work with businesses right across the country to drive economic growth, the number one mission of this government.
Well, I asked Dr. Kamran Maroof, Associate Professor in Supply Chain Analytics at the University of Bradford, why the supermarkets are lobbying the government on this.
We've got to really appreciate the downstream consequences of farmers having to pay this inheritance tax. And what does that actually mean then for supply chains? And if we look at, historical shortages that we have had, either when farmers have protested or when there hasn't been produce, it leads to disrupted supply chains.
There are some very big businesses involved in this. Do you think that they could change government policy?
I mean, we've seen this in the past. We have seen supermarkets, big brands, big names get together and lobby in the past. We've seen, even with the sugar tax in recent times, and even to some extent, the Brexit and trade policy. So supermarkets do have clout and they do have the ability to lobby. And of course, let's not forget, this doesn't do any harm to public image for supermarkets, who often are seen in a very negative light. So yes, they do have the ability to influence, but equally, there's a real concern for supermarkets that if these tax burdens are not alleviated, it could impact the sector as a whole and lead to, volatility within supply chains.
I mean, Morrison's recently had one of its food depots blockaded by tractors, which did stop distribution and which did lead to empty shelves. Could it be that the supermarkets are actually just now saying this could have really immediate consequences for us because farmers are getting so cross about it?
Yeah, most definitely. And that's just one example of a disruption happening from a supermarket perspective. It's them needing to protect the supply chains and protect, I would say, the long-term stability of the agricultural sector as a whole.
We've asked most of the supermarkets if they would speak to us about this. And as yet, we haven't been able to secure an interview with any of them at all. And I think that's quite interesting. Why do you think that might be? What are the risks for them?
I think at this moment in time, things are moving fast. Your supermarkets probably would want to put a unified response out rather than individually. I mean, they've cited support, of course, for the farmers in the media. But I think at this moment in time, you probably have Tesco's, Sainsbury's, Morrison's on speed dial to one another, speaking about how they can potentially join forces to help support the farmers and influence policy. So I think it's a little early for them to comment.
Yeah. I mean, the more cynical of our listeners may say that Rachel Reeves has been absolutely adamant that she will not be making any changes to this policy. So the odds are that the supermarket's involvement won't achieve anything, really, apart from good PR for the supermarkets. I mean, if the supermarket sector really wants to support farmers, why don't they just pay them a bit more for what they produce?
Exactly that. And this goes back to a more fundamental question around supermarket dominance and to what extent they can remain competitive. And we also got to understand it from a consumer point of view as well. In the UK, unfortunately, we are very resistant to price fluctuations. If the customers are willing to have the cost passed on to them, it then means that the supermarkets are a little bit more flexible. So ultimately, it does go back to the broader systemic challenge that we have faced.
That's Dr. Kamran Maroof from the University of Bradford. And that's all we've got time for today. I'm Kaz Graham. The producer is Beatrice Fenton. And Farming Today this week is a BBC Audio Bristol production.